Hey guys, welcome back, it's Ripe again. In today's video, my homeowner association claims that the entire neighborhood must be child-free and thus my 4-year-old granddaughter resides here illegally. The HOA wants to evict her and terrorizes us with all sorts of legal shenanigans, and I honestly could not be more upset. Here is what happened. The title story starts like this. I know that just looking at the title you might think there was some kind of typo when it came to the age. However, sadly there wasn't, and the granddaughter in my story really was only 4 years old at the time. Now she is about 7 and things have calmed down. I want to tell you all the story though, so you can see how an HOA has the potential to be run by heartless creatures with no compassion. So after a terrible car accident, my son and his wife passed away. They had a little girl, and since me and my husband were the only family left, we took her in. She did not know what was going on. Even though we were in our 60s, we knew that we wanted to raise her. We were her only family, and I was not gonna throw my granddaughter into the foster care system. So normally this would not be too big of a deal, but my husband and I had moved into a child-free neighborhood catered more towards elderly people. Now I knew right away that there was gonna be a problem, and we had been looking into solutions. There were special petitions we could file in order to get an exception to the rule. We were also debating just selling the house and trying to find something affordable in another neighborhood. We are both retired and on fixed income, so the options were limited and would take a while. We decided to try the first method to see if we could get lucky. And by the way guys, just to quickly intervene, I'm kind of curious how there can be neighborhoods in the world where young people, or especially children, are not allowed. That does not really seem right to me, but anyway, before any of the paperwork could be finished and sent in, the HOA had sent their own private security officers. They came to the house and told me that they had a letter of eviction. It wasn't for me and my husband though, only for the 4-year-old girl. I looked at them like they were crazy and asked them how they expected to evict a 4-year-old girl. Throw her onto the streets by herself? Tell her to find a job and get her own place? I found that entire experience horrifying, and the HOA people seemed to just shrug and say, well, that was the rules. I called the HOA and explained the petition we were filing to try and get an exception made because the situation fell under acceptable reasons. However, they told me not to bother and that by the time the stuff was filed, they were gonna make sure the child was removed. They even went as far as to say that they would probably just shred the paperwork because there was no way they would be making any kind of exception. I found this unfair because they were going against their own rules and policies, like children making up a game as they went along. We found out that selling the house was gonna be a long process and we couldn't afford to move until the home was sold. The HOA eventually called the police, claiming that 2 people of our age raising a 4-year-old was clearly neglect and the child should be taken away. CPS was brought in and did their own evaluation and inspection to find that nothing was wrong with her being in the household. Still, when a case is opened, it doesn't close that quickly, and we got many more visits from them over a couple of years. Each time them saying that everything seemed perfect. Sure, she was a little sad, but that was normal for anybody grieving, especially a child. We found a lawyer that was willing to work with our budget and told us that we were in the right to try and file the paperwork to keep our house and granddaughter. The fact that all the HOA official calls are recorded would also end up working to our benefit. He asked us to try and get letters from some neighbors saying that they were okay with the child because it would make a stronger case. I was worried because I know people move here to be away from kids most of the time. My neighbors though were supportive and told me that if it was their grandchild, they would be having the same fight as us. Now, we were not actually suing the HOA because we were on defense, as they were suing us. They wanted to claim that since we had broken the bylaws, they wanted us to leave, but also forfeit the rights of the house to them. Meaning they would sell it and get all the money, while we would essentially end up homeless or living out of motels with our limited money. Our lawyer was a very nice young man who told us not to worry too much about that because in our countersuit we were gonna show that we did not actually break any rules technically. Law has always been a little lost on me, so I will try and explain what happened when we went to the court to the best that we could. The HOA had their case of it being a child-free neighborhood and us knowingly breaking that rule by bringing in a 4-year-old child, then refusing to follow through with the eviction notice they sent to get rid of her. I'm gonna be honest, their side seemed pretty solid and I was nervous, but our lawyer came up with a good defense. Looking deeper into the rules, a child can be brought in under emergency circumstances and given 6 months to either rehome the child or get an exception granted. The eviction notice came only after 2 months, meaning it was not valid. Then in the countersuit, our lawyer was suing the HOA for not following their own bylaws. He played the tape of the phone conversation saying that they would just put the paperwork through the shredder instead of looking at it. We had the papers with us that day in court and it was given directly to the judge instead of having to go through the HOA. From the entire case, 2 major things happened. The first being that the HOA was found to not be following their own bylaws and in so not protecting the rights of the people like they are meant to. They were given the choices of either disbanding the entire HOA or letting all paperwork go through the town hall. Or they could all leave the HOA and a new board would be chosen and eyed carefully to make sure they are acting right. They actually opted for the first choice and I had a feeling that they were worried about being dug any deeper into. The second and more important thing was the judge granted us the exception and we were allowed to stay in our home with our granddaughter. At times it was hard, but we made sure to let her go on plenty of playdates and see friends from school often. Without other kids living in the neighborhood, we wanted to still try and give her as normal a life as possible. She was happy and slowly started to adjust to her new normal with us raising her. Now 3 years later, she is a happy little girl who does not seem to notice or care about being the only kid around. On days when she doesn't see her friends, she enjoys making friends with the neighbors. She has become very popular as being the best helper for gardening and baking. It's almost like she is the grandchild to everybody in the neighborhood who does not have or does not see their own. And here, Ripe Stars, I gotta say, I was not surprised in the slightest. The only criminals that would ever even think about evicting an orphan is clearly a terrible, awful HOA. Seriously, I could not think about any other sort of organization that would even think about something like this. But anyway, good for OP in the end to stand up for his rights and ultimately win. Either way, if you enjoy the HOA stories, please don't forget to like the video and leave a comment because that would help me tremendously. The next one is titled Getting Revenge on Stupid Idiots. My next door neighbors have rubbed me the wrong way ever since I moved here 3 years ago. The husband, let's call him Mike, struck me as a little sleazy, and the wife, we will call her Sharon, seemed nosy and judgmental as hell. But I know myself, I know I am quick to judge and get stuck in a certain opinion of people. My daughter is about the same age as theirs, let's call her Maria, and she has a bit of a trouble making friends, so when Sharon suggested they have weekly playdates, alternating between their house and mine, I put my dislike of her aside and agreed. It all seemed to be going fine for a while, but my daughter eventually seemed less enthusiastic about going over to their place. I talked to her about it and she admitted that she didn't like Sharon. Apparently Sharon had been watching them play and directing them on how to play, and she often interrupted to ask my daughter intrusive questions about our family and especially about my kid's paternity. My daughter is a picky eater, so to start with, I would send her over with snacks I know she can eat in case there was nothing there she could eat. My daughter had told me she did not need those snacks because they had food there that she could eat, but it turns out Sharon had told her she was being rude for bringing her own food to someone else's house, and if she wanted to eat, she had to eat what Sharon gave her, so of course she just did not eat there. On top of that, Sharon would invite my daughter to Sunday school every time and had gotten very pushy, even though she consistently said no. My daughter still wanted to play with Maria, so we decided the playdates could continue, but only if they were at our place. I made my excuses to Sharon and initially she agreed to only have playdates at my house, but when Sharon and Maria showed up, they both came inside instead of Sharon leaving Maria at the door as usual. In front of her daughter, my daughter and my son, Sharon said they'd been praying about it as a family and God had guided them and told them not to leave their daughter with an unmarried mother because apparently it shows I cannot make good choices and they are worried I would influence her to make poor decisions with her life and stray from her faith. And then they left. So I was right about Sharon being nosy and judgmental, and I decided to find out if I was right about Mike. I made accounts on Instagram and Facebook posing as an attractive young lady with lots of somewhat local friends. I followed him on Instagram, he followed back, and he immediately messaged me, and the messages quickly went from vaguely flirty to obviously trying to get some. I then took screenshots of the messages and sent them to Sharon in a Facebook message. I did not get a response, but I did see Mike storming out of the house with a small suitcase and driving off rather recklessly. He did come back a couple of days later, so I have not destroyed their marriage or anything, but I definitely put a dent in it. And here, Ripe Stars, if you ever had to deal with a crazy neighbor like this, I would love to hear your story either in the comments or on r/Ripe Stories on Reddit, which is our own subreddit where you can post your own stories and there is a good chance that I will read them in a video. Either way, the next one is a pro-revenge story and it is absolutely epic. So my friend, I will call her Sandy, worked at a travel agency in British Columbia, Canada. It was a small, owner-operated business with the owner and 3 employees, including my friend. Everyone worked Monday to Friday from 9 AM to 5 PM. One of my friend's co-workers, I will call her Jane, an older woman in her early to mid-60s, was a long-time nuisance employee. Among other sketchy behavior, Jane was always scamming ways to take time off over and above her official paid vacation time. In order to make up for the lost hours, she would claim overtime hours/pay by supposedly going into the office in her off hours to finish up work without being requested by the owner to do so. Despite being caught in her own lies on a number of occasions and being warned about trying to claim for unsanctioned overtime, the owner of the travel agency was reluctant to officially reprimand Jane or even get rid of her. The reason being is the owner discovered after she had hired Jane that Jane actually had been fired from her previous job at another local travel agency for pulling the same stunts. However, Jane had sued her former employer for unfair dismissal and had won a settlement. After a few years of my friend Sandy working at the travel agency, the owner was ready to retire and offered to sell the business to my friend. Sandy took her up on the deal and took over the business while keeping on Jane and the other employee. Once again, just as the previous owner was afraid to get rid of Jane, so was Sandy for fear of being sued. When Sandy took over the business, she instituted guidelines regarding taking time off and she established an official no overtime policy. Jane would still try with her shenanigans, but was far less successful in getting what she wanted with my friend in charge. However, Jane still had one trick up her sleeve when she wanted to take time off on a whim. Sandy was a divorced single mom of 2 boys who were heavily involved in youth hockey. She would sometimes leave the office an hour or 2 before closing to get her boys to hockey practice or a game. In order to avoid requesting in person and potentially being denied, Jane would wait for Sandy to be out of the office to book a day off if she didn't feel like coming into work or had made plans. Sandy would then arrive at work the next morning, only to discover that Jane was not coming in. Despite this happening a number of times, Sandy would usually let it slide since there was now a definite no overtime policy. Therefore, Jane could no longer claim to come into work on the weekend or after hours in order to try and make up for the day off. She would either miss out on a day's pay, in turn saving Sandy money as the owner, or it would come out of her remaining paid vacation days. Moreover, 2 people in the office at one time could usually handle everything. Jane not coming in was really a no-loss situation for Sandy. There was one time, however, when Sandy was going to be away for 1 or 2 workdays just before the weekend to take her boys to a hockey tournament. She told both Jane and the other employee, both verbally and in writing, that they could not book time off for the dates in question since she would be away and needed both of them in the office. Within a few days of giving this notice, Sandy went into the office on a Saturday to do some paperwork and go through the sales for the week. This is when she discovered that only the day before, Jane had booked a trip for her daughter and son-in-law to Las Vegas as well as a plane ticket in her name to Calgary, where her daughter lived. Both the trip to Vegas and the ticket to Calgary coincided with the date Sandy would be out of the office. Sandy then checked the vacation booking schedule to further discover that Jane had indeed booked the days off that she had expressly been told she couldn't have. Not mentioning that she had discovered the travel Jane had booked for herself and her daughter. Sandy emailed Jane telling her she would have to deny her the days off since she had already been told they were unavailable because she, Sandy, would be away and needed Jane in the office. Through a continued series of email exchanges, Jane replied and outright lied to Sandy with some excuse about her daughter getting some long-awaited medical treatment or surgery, and she needed to go to Calgary to help out for a few days and look after her granddaughter. Sandy replied to this lie by telling Jane she knew about the trip she had booked to Vegas for her daughter and son-in-law, that Jane's trip to Calgary was most likely to babysit her granddaughter while her daughter was in Vegas, and that she would still have to deny Jane the days off, especially since she booked them after being told they were unavailable. Jane countered in her subsequent reply without even addressing the fact that she had been caught in a lie, that she had been a dedicated employee of the travel agency for several years and could not understand why she was being treated so unfairly after all she had done for the business. She then wrote that since she was not being treated as a valued employee, she had no choice but to retire and was given her 2 weeks' notice. Despite Jane's threat, Sandy replied that she would still be unable to grant her the days off and left it at that without making any mention of Jane's threat to quit and retire. Sandy then contacted her accountant, who also acted as her de facto business advisor, and explained what had happened with Jane. Also aware of Jane's previous shenanigans, Sandy's accountant told her that this was the out she had been looking for with Jane and she had it all in writing. He told her that Jane had essentially resigned and retired, and all Sandy needed to do was honor Jane's desire to do so, let her finish out her 2 weeks or pay her 2 weeks' wages in lieu of no further severance pay legally required since she hadn't been fired. The following Monday, Sandy went into the office early, accompanied by her long-term boyfriend to act as a witness. She put Jane's belongings from her desk into a box and took the things that were property of the business. Since Jane was old school and had resisted inputting client information in the computer database, this also included a small box filled with index cards which had client phone numbers, addresses, credit card information and so on, and other personal info noted on them. In the meantime, the other employee had arrived for work and they all waited for Jane to show up. Jane arrived just before 9 o'clock, acting as though nothing had happened, and greeted everyone with a "good morning" as she walked through the front door. However, she was apparently taken slightly aback when she noticed Sandy's boyfriend seated in the far corner of the office. At this point, Jane was midway to her desk when Sandy informed her that there was no need to go any further and that she had accepted Jane's notification of retirement. She then handed Jane a check compensating her for the hours she had worked in the current pay period, as well as 2 weeks' wages in lieu of Jane finishing out her final 2 weeks before her retirement. Jane was dumbfounded and went into panic mode. "But I didn't retire, I'm not ready to retire." Sandy responded that indeed she had retired, given her notice, and had proof of it in writing. All Jane could do was continue repeating, "But I didn't retire, I'm not ready to retire," while unsuccessfully attempting to get the support of the other employee who refused to come to her defense. Sandy then pointed to the box containing Jane's belongings, wished her a happy retirement, and told her to leave the office. Jane quickly rifled through the box and noticed that the small box containing the index cards with client information was not there. She insisted that Sandy return it to her, which Sandy refused to do, explaining that it was property of the business, contained personal client info, and that she would be in violation of Canadian privacy laws if she were to let Jane take it. Jane's shock had now turned to obstinance and she refused to leave without the box. Both the other employee and Sandy's boyfriend had started to get involved, repeatedly telling Jane to just leave. Sandy then informed Jane that if she did not leave, they would have to call the RCMP, Canadian police, at which point Sandy's boyfriend dialed 911 to inform the dispatcher of a disgruntled former employee at XYZ Travel Agency who was refusing to leave the premises. Within a few minutes, 2 police officers arrived and Jane immediately ran to the door, ranting about being fired and about the missing box of client info. In order to de-escalate the situation, one police officer told Jane to come outside and explain to him her side of the story. The other officer remained in the office to hear Sandy's side of the story, agreeing that Jane was not legally entitled to the box of client info. The other officer then re-entered the business and told Jane to wait outside. He said that Jane was insisting that Sandy was holding onto her personal belongings, namely a box of important information. Both Sandy and the officer who had spoken to her explained the contents of the box to the other officer, who in turn agreed it was not Jane's property. The police officers then picked up the larger box of Jane's personal belongings, took it outside to Jane and told her she needed to go home. To rub salt in Jane's wounds, the next day, Sandy put up a large sign in the window of the business congratulating Jane on her retirement and even put a small announcement in the local newspaper doing the same thing. The icing on the piece of revenge cake was Sandy, when filling out the necessary government forms for when an employee quits, gets fired, or retires, made sure to check the box labeled "retired" for the reason for Jane no longer being employed. By doing so, Jane was ineligible to collect unemployment insurance benefits. And wow, ripe stars, I gotta say, what OP did to Jane was absolutely brilliant, and maybe at times even a little bit cruel if you ask me. Do you think that Jane deserved everything she had gotten in this story? Let me know in the comments. I would definitely not want to mess with OP. Apparently, if you're on OP's wrong side, OP will come at you like a tsunami. And with this, we have reached the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, and please don't forget to check out my playlists for more awesome videos. Also, if you haven't already, I would very much appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell to not miss any videos. Thank you so much, I will see you again tomorrow.